I call this meeting of the Committee on Housing Finance and Policy to order. And let it be known we have quorum, even though we're not taking any formal actions on bills today. We'll move to the first item on the agenda. I need approval of the minutes. Was there a member that would like to move the minutes? Representative Scrabble moves the minutes.
So moved.
All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Minutes are approved. All right, so today we're going to just do some testimony, and I'm thankful that we have two members here today to talk about their experience on the HOA working group. And I think this is going to be a really important topic for this committee. So this is going to kind of tee us up to really dive in and hear about what they went through and what they experienced. And then that should kind of set us up to maybe write some policy and get some things on the right track. So I think first we'll let the LCC take over with testimony, and then we'll have Representative Bonner and Representative Mecklen take over from there. So welcome to committee. Please introduce yourself for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Andrew, Mr. Chair and members. My name is Andrew George. I'm nonpartisan staff with the Legislative Coordinating Commission. I helped administrate the working group on common interest communities and homeowners associations that met over the interim from September of last year until January. And I'll be walking through kind of the duties that the task force, the working group was charged with, some of the materials and information that we received, and give a high-level overview of the recommendations that were ultimately finalized in the report, which you should have in your packets as well. So the working group was created last session in the 2024 session. To study the prevalence and impact of common interest communities and homeowners associations in Minnesota, and how existing laws, that's Chapter 515B, the Minnesota Common Interest Ownership Act, regulating CICs and HOAs, help homeowners and tenants access housing. There are several duties that the working group was charged with, including how many CICs and HOAs exist in Minnesota, how many people reside in them, and where they're located. Governing documents commonly used by CICs and HOAs, and whether those governing documents create barriers for participation by homeowners. Fees and costs commonly associated with CICs and HOAs, and how those fees have increased, including the cost of property management, accounting, and attorney's fees that are assessed to the homeowners. As well, the working group reviewed whether there should be uniform statutory standards regarding those fees and fines and costs. Further duties include reviewing how the organization and management of HOAs, including management companies and the boards, impact the affordability of CICs, the impact of HOAs and CICs on the housing market and housing costs, racial disparity in home ownership as it relates to CICs, the accessibility and affordability of CICs for Minnesotans with disabilities, how other states regulate HOAs and best practices that around the country in other states related to board transparency, dispute resolution, and foreclosures for HOA homeowners, and how current laws governing CICs may be consolidated and reformed for clarity and to improve the experience of homeowners. The ultimate duty of the working group was to recommend legislative reforms generally to Chapter 515B or other methods to regulate CICs, including the consolidation or codification of existing chapters regulating these entities. Those recommendations are in the final report that was submitted to the legislature. There were 20 members of the working group, 4 legislative members, 1 from each of the caucuses, and there was a bipartisan, bicameral leadership for the working group chaired by Representative Bonner and vice chaired by Senator Lucero. Additionally, Representative Mecklen and Senator Pah were on the working group. The rest of the membership were appointees from various other organizations and were public members and included homeowner advocate organizations, industry members, attorneys for boards and homeowners, local government staff, a member from the Attorney General's office, and a member from Minnesota Housing. The working group invited, during its meetings, invited a broad group of stakeholders and attorneys for homeowners, both homeowners and common interest communities, property management companies, so the industry side of the issue. So subject matters from both sides of the issue, so homeowners and CICs and homeowner advocates to present information on CICs in Minnesota. Generally, there were presentations from the National Conference of State Legislatures to review the issue around the country and what other states are doing, legal aid, and again, industry and professional organizations impacted and involved in the issue, attorneys, the League of Minnesota Cities on the issue of municipalities as it relates to HOAs, and a host of public testifiers. From each of these presentations and from just general discussion, 8 issue areas were kind of identified and solidified for the group to address, and those include governance, and that includes board elections, open meetings, access to documents, so those are the bylaws, generally, dissolution of HOAs and personal freedoms for homeowners in CICs and HOAs. Financial interests, that includes the financial reporting side of the boards, insurance for HOAs and reserves, dispute resolution, registration and licensing, education and training, assessments, and those include the general assessments and special assessments, fines and fees, and finally foreclosures, municipalities, and civil rights. The working group invited public testimony at all the meetings and to share their stories and experiences that they've had with as owners in HOAs and CICs. And those occurred at working group meetings, and as well the working group traveled to 3 different locations around the Twin Cities metro area in Maple Grove, Maplewood, and Burnsville to facilitate a greater input from the public on their experiences. Issues we saw, the working group saw included conflicts of interest with CICs, some kickbacks from vendors to property management companies, board transparency, attorneys' fees, rules and regulations, fines and fees, the ability to speak at meetings, a lack in education for boards and lack of experience, and just generally a lack of oversight for HOAs. I'll shift into the recommendations that were finalized at the final meeting and then are included in that final report to the legislature. From presenters, from the subject matter experts, from working group discussion, the members finalized 41 recommendations and reforms generally to 515B. And those were categorized in these 8 issue areas that I highlighted. I will try to do my best. There are 41. I'll try to walk through them fairly quickly. And let's see. Yes, for the governance issue, recommendations include establishment of clear, reasonable, and justifiable standards for boards and property management decisions, to automatically revoke unenforced covenants unless HOAs renew them, setting limitations on practices dictating single-family homes, and setting limitations on practice dictating private property and use of private property that only the homeowner can use. So those would be things inside or on the property of the homeowner, balconies, gardens, things like that. Requiring boards and property managers to provide an open forum for meetings, providing clear and reasonable guidelines for when an HOA cannot be created, and removing 515B governance over housing cooperatives. So, and allowing for, so that's the housing cooperative statute 308C to rule there. For financial interests, the working group recommended allowing housing improvement area loans to be administered by both cities as well as Minnesota Housing, using HIA loans to make HOA repairs more affordable, requiring associations to report annual financial accounting, recommending a work group on the issue of HOA insurance, establishing conflict of interest standards and statute, property managers cannot require an association to work with a specific vendor. That was an issue that came up several times. And requiring boards or property managers to seek multiple bids for vendors for repairs or anything like that. And bids should be made available and retained for a minimum record retention period. Let's see. For dispute resolution, providing parameters for homeowners to reasonably ask questions without incurring fees or attorney's fees, appropriating money for a housing advocacy center, and then creating an office of ombudsman for homeowners, and requiring that office to facilitate open templates for and maintain open templates for documents, and requiring participation by the office in the mediation process between homeowners and the boards. Maintaining some sort of database, a wiki for materials and resources, and recommending a way for homeowners to resolve disputes apart from the courts. For registration and licensing, the recommendations from the working group included mandating that CICs provide information without charge to homeowners about their rights and responsibilities, requiring licensing of HOA managers, and maintaining a public database that includes all associations, property managers, and board members, and that would be housed with the Secretary of State. For assessments, creating some sort of, the working group recommended to create some sort of minimum amount related to fees. That would be some sort of minimum threshold of fees accrued, or a time of delinquent fees leading to foreclosure. Creating caps and standards on fees that are reasonable and justifiable. Setting a reasonable standardness of rules, and including a 30-day notice around non-emergency fee increases and a 60-day notice for special assessments. And Minnesota Housing should explore the feasibility of expanding homeowner loan programs to include financing of common areas. For foreclosure, the recommendations included ensuring new foreclosure laws passed, that could potentially be passed, apply to older townhomes built before 1994, recommending that HOA boards not foreclosing a lien for fines under $2,500, requiring that some sort of pre-foreclosure notice be provided, and notice, and as well, that notice should include the right to postpone a sheriff's sale, as well as for foreclosure, prohibiting that aesthetic rules being a foreclosable offense. Recommendations for the intersection of municipalities and homeowners. The recommendations were to make HIA-type loans available to all CICs and require all cities or other state entities to offer HIA loans as an option, and to eliminate the sunset that would, of HIA loans that is currently for June of 2028. As well as ensuring the elimination of double taxation, and that's the phenomenon of taxes in addition to HOA dues, as well as HIA loans, and allowing for the payoff of the loan before the end of the term, and finally prohibiting municipalities from requiring common elements that would necessitate the creation of an HOA. For the last issue area of civil rights, the working group recommended to study social return on investment of HOAs and determine how beneficial they are and where the money goes, to prohibit HOAs from imposing blanket rental screening restrictions, to require HOAs to allow disabled owners to make modifications to their units at their own expense, and to provide a standard state of Minnesota created template form that can be used to request reasonable accommodations. And that concludes the final recommendations that were that were included in the final report to the legislature. I'll also note that there was a list of some 150-plus general recommendations that the working group also discussed and recommended in a general form. But these 41 that I've included here and in the report were the ones finalized by the working group. And you can find all those recommendations, all of them, the final and the general recommendations on the working group's website at the LCC. That, Mr. Chair, concludes my presentation of the high-level presentation of what the working group did and the recommendations. And I'm happy to take questions on anything.
Thank you, Mr. George. Is there any questions from members of the committee before we move on to the next? Representative Myers.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple questions for Andrew, is it, right?
Yeah.
I see in here that one of the recommendations is, a public database of all board members listed on the Secretary of State. I haven't been part of an HOA. Are most of those positions volunteer positions?
Mr. George.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question, Representative. Are you saying are the board members' positions volunteer positions?
Yep.
That'd be correct. Board members are volunteer. Yeah.
Representative Myers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Leads me to think that, if we want people to step forward and volunteer in their community, this could be something that would prohibit, people would think twice maybe about trying to volunteer in their local communities if some of this stuff is going to be released and made public. I'm just wondering if that type of conversation or thought process was brought up during the work process.
Mr. George.
Mr. Chair, Representative, thank you for the question. I can't recall if that was brought up in the working group. As legislation continues, I'm sure the authoring, the bill authors will consider that stuff.
Here.
And incorporate it into their thought process.
Any further questions, Representative Myers? And this, I think, is a good segue right to the chair and member who are on the committee, kind of give us more of that deep insight. So if there's no more further questions from Mr. George, we'll hand it over to Representative Bonner and Representative Meckland.
Go ahead.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
I did want to speak to that last question, and I feel badly because we're putting poor Mr. George on the spot as to what legislation is being drafted and so forth. And while he does have some cursory knowledge of that because he has been an invaluable resource, I also don't want to take him out of his comfort zone to have to speak to that. Yes, Senator Pa, in specific, is working on that specific provision. There are two ways in which we approached this legislation coming forward. We took the recommendations. We used a number of criteria to try to help float up to the top those priority items that could be done now, that had the highest impact and would provide the most relief to homeowners and to be able to address the issue squarely. But we also separated that into two buckets, one in which we could do policy only and one which might require some money, right? Because we know budget concerns are an issue. The larger policy bill is in its final stages of drafting. Ms. Davis, actually behind you, has been instrumental in that, and Ms. Priya in the Senate. There is a bill from Senator Pa that is addressing some of those issues about licensing and registration and providing greater clarity on when an HOA is actually, or a nonprofit is an HOA or a community organization. Typically, right now, when they register at the Secretary of State, that is not clear. So that is the intent behind that specific requirement, is to be able to have greater clarity on who they are, where they are, and how many there are, and specific basic information on the association. In terms of the privacy, yes, we have been having numerous conversations about that because we do acknowledge that these are volunteer positions, and we certainly don't want to discourage people from being available in those positions, but also want to be respectful of their personal privacy as well. There is a suggestion that we've been talking about in terms of if we ask them to provide information such as contact information, whether some of that information could be classified as private and not searchable to protect the privacy of those individuals. So that bill is still a work in progress, so it may evolve and change over time, so I don't want to set us in stone on that particular provision, but we do know that that will require some monies going through the Office of the Secretary of State, where we register all nonprofits. So that bill is still being worked on.
Representative Myers?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Representative. I think, for people here, it's hard enough to, find good people to run for office. And, some of us, take more heat than others, especially during campaign time. But I mean, in these positions, I just want to make sure that some of these provisions aren't so open-ended and, some consideration of maybe that's something that would fall on the chair position. And I don't know statewide if every HOA is completely full with people, if this would hurt that. I mean, again, we want to try to make sure we have good people, serving the communities that they live in. So just, considering something like that.
Thank you.
Representative Bonner?
Mr. Chair, and I also wanted to follow up that it is our hope that the policy bill that is in its final stages will provide better clarity around roles and responsibilities for boards and board members. It will give them better definitions of what those expectations are, and hopefully eliminate some of the problems with transparency and ambiguity that currently exist that lead to a lot of conflict. And a lot of those challenges that we see. We also are proposing some significant changes in terms of dispute resolution to address some of those issues and to find a clear path that also takes some of that onus off of board members. We really want to be in a place where we're setting up board members who are acting as volunteers to be in a place to achieve success, right? If you're stepping up of your own time and your own volition to do that work, we want to make sure that you're supported and that you have the best possible opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Representative Bonner. Any follow-up, Representative Myers? Okay, well, with that, why don't we?
Yeah, I just want
Representative
to, if I may, Mr. Chair. In part of what we've heard repeatedly in all the different testimony, and Chair Bonner did, I mean, we had a lot of people there from all kinds of stakeholders. To try to address what Representative Myers is asking here, a lot of these people may run for these HOA boards but have little understanding of what their parameters are. And so that's been a big part of the conversation that if this Ombudsman's office would have very clear available information on for education training so they understand what they can and cannot do, where the guardrails need to be, what the boundaries are. There was a lot of examples of people suddenly getting on a board and not maybe with the best intentions or simply not knowing and trying to figure out the least cumbersome but most effective way so that they have a fairly good understanding of what they are not only seeking to do or now are been elected to do. And that's where some of this comes from. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of, I would say, people with a lot of conflict, as Chair Bonner just said, but a lot of it seemed to come from lack of understanding on one side or the other. Whether it was the homeowner not knowing what their responsibilities were, or it wasn't very transparent. There was a lot of testimony of when something did arise, they would simply send an email to the HOA or property management company that was brought on by the HOA, and then in return, they suddenly get a bill back assessed to them from a lawyer that they never knew they were contacting. And so this was it was actually kind of interesting to learn all this, because some of the stuff that didn't make it in here is because it's so complex and it affects so many different departments, and it's certainly work that's going to be continued to be had. But I think Chair Bonner really said it well. It was obviously there's going to be financial restraints. So what is the most policy we can do, and without spending a tremendous amount of money? The omnibus bill is floating around here somewhere. And that was one thing we found, that like the Attorney General's office, if something really bad happens to a homeowner, there's nowhere for them to go, short of hiring their own attorney. And they have to have some kind of stopgap that is an in-between, somebody that can help resolve some of this conflict. And I believe that the language that we've come up with on that, that's, the bill is here, will help address that. It's not an overnight fix, but I believe the Secretary of State, going forward as these HOAs or all these nonprofits renew, there is now going to be a question, are you an HOA? And that's how we're eventually going to identify them. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I think before we go into any more questions, let's give both of you the chance to kind of talk about your experience, give us a rundown of what you saw, and just kind of tee up this committee for, it sounds like, the bills that are coming, so we can be ready to have a discussion on these bills. And just thank you, Representative Bonner, for joining us today, and Representative Mecklen, you just had to walk over there, so thank you for showing up to committee.
Well, and I thought I'd move over to demonstrate that we do actually like each other. And Representative Mecklen, I believe, will have a pivotal role as a co-author on the policy bill when it's ready. So I do like him, and I think we're hoping to have a big bra moment of bipartisanship here. I think what's really universal is, in the last few years, I've been to a lot of NCLSL conferences, and ironically, this issue around CICs and HOAs has cropped up quite a bit in conversation. What's really apparent is that this isn't a Minnesota problem. It is a national problem. And it is a problem because what we've seen is that there are various calculations that cities make in order to help further the growth of their cities. So in many respects, they're great, right? Because a lot of times the builders will agree to build basic infrastructure or things like that that might be a barrier to helping get those communities built. But as that's been happening, what we see is more and more HOAs and condos and common interest communities and co-ops forming around the nation. Here in Minnesota, we talk about, and so forth, we want to talk about that in 2023, which is the most recent area where we have figures, 82.4% of new homes that were built in an HOA. So that old adage of, well, if you don't like it in an HOA, just go somewhere else, doesn't really hold true anymore, right? There really aren't a whole lot of other options. In fact, I heard from homeowners in Maple Grove who spent well above market price in Maple Grove, so they didn't have to be in an association. They were that averse. So I think it says that there's some interesting trends happening nationally and here in Minnesota. We're hearing that everywhere. And, what we hear a lot is that those choices really aren't as prevalent as they are, and especially when we talk about affordability. The overriding issues here, as a New Jersey appellate court described it, that there's broad power to levy fines and governmental power within a lot of our boards and HOAs. And what one law review article termed as the HOA, we're creating essentially what are private governments, right? That often have the tendency to serve to deprive homeowners of certain liberties and traditionally possessed by property owners. Another law review article noted that we give a small amount of people nearly unlimited power to impose whatever restrictions they deem necessary. Another one stated that HOAs frequently enforce rules that would otherwise be clear constitutional violations if committed by a state agency. And of course, if you like a good bit of comedy, many of you have probably seen the John Oliver skit on Last Weekend Tonight, which was an examination of HOAs. And he basically said that HOAs can have the authority of a government and collect fees and fines like one, but when it comes to accountability, they can actively resist in ways that government officials can only dream of. And while that's funny and it's tongue-in-cheek, the reality is what often has happened is we have a real lack of checks and balances in some of what's happening. And we hear that a lot in the stories. While the work group wasn't required to do listening sessions, I personally felt, and I think in talking to other legislative members and work group members, that hearing from the general public was something that we felt was really, really important. So we intended to do a tour and try to hit all the four corners and do that. We had to compromise a little bit on the last one, but trying to get the Northeast, the Northwest, and then we had to kind of combine the Southeast and Southwest in our last one. But to hear from actual homeowners. to hear what experiences they had, what challenges and difficulties they were having, what barriers they had, what were the things that were driving up costs for them and making things less affordable, what was really happening on the ground. And, we took that list and we took all of that feedback and really prioritized it again. And we used a set of about 5 core principles to do that. We talked about things like using plain language. You shouldn't have to have an attorney to translate your basic roles and responsibilities as a board member, as a property manager, as an attorney. We wanted every recommendation that we made to be reasonable. We wanted to be clear, to have fairness, and to be transparent. And that was the governing principles that we set out for all of our work group members from the start. And towards the end, when we had to prioritize those things, what we try to do, again, is think about what can we do now to provide the largest amount of relief for most homeowners and really start to put our arms around it, right? We know a few states such as Florida, Illinois, I think New Jersey and Colorado, a few have started to try to nibble at the edges or try to do something a little more comprehensive. But to my knowledge, this is the first time that any state has tried to do anything quite as comprehensive in a full sweep. And so, again, we separated that into what we could do right now from a policy standpoint, and we really are planning to cover everything from governance that talks about open meetings, documents and bylaws, the ability to have dissolution, freedoms from specific mandates, talking about financial interests and financial reporting, making sure that documents and financial disclosures are available to all homeowners, talking about the real realities behind insurance and reserves, which are really driving up costs and preventing them from being really affordable options. We talked about our recommendations hitting dispute resolution, registration and licensing, education and training, all forms of assessments, general, special, including fines and fees, documents related to those, notices, foreclosure, talking about the role of municipalities in this, as well as things around civil rights and disabilities. And you will find that the recommendations of the report actually reflect all of those, as will the bills that are coming forward. And with that, I can tell you, we spoke about the large policy bill. What we didn't talk about is that there are 3 other bills that are very likely to come forward. One is the piece about databases and registration. That, will, of course, will have a cost. The ombudsman, which would be sort of the gold standard in terms of dispute resolution. Again, it's not that we don't want to do what we can for homeowners right now, but in many cases, the law doesn't support it. There is no law to lean back on if homeowners feel that they've been mistreated. And so this basically helps set some parameters and also create some dispute resolution pathways, both internally before we end up in a court, and then hopefully a pathway if that does not resolve the issue. And then finally, the issue of insurance is one that is a really thorny and difficult issue. Because of the parameters of the work group, we just didn't have the sufficient resources and time to dive as deeply into those issues, because you have to talk about commerce, you have to talk about legal responsibilities and all kinds of things that really are a little more complex. So I think what we are planning to do is also suggest that we create a task force to take a deeper dive on specifically that issue and the issues that are impacting HOAs and how we could even do some better funding options. So when homeowners are faced with really big ticket items like $20,000 for a new roof or so forth, we had one group that told us they had an assessment for $80,000. Now, I don't know about you, but if this association is considered an affordable form of housing, and you're now be handing a bill for $80,000 with very little way to get a loan for that money and no other way to finance it, that creates a real hardship. And what we're seeing is that it often is driving our lower income families, many of our families of color, many of our vulnerable families, single family households, out of those forms of housing. And I think that's something that we really want to address. So those bills will also be coming, but hopefully we will have, within the next week or two, we will have a policy bill for you all to take a look at. And I'll
Awesome. Thank you, Representative Bonner. To you, Representative Beckland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Some of what Chair Bonner touched on, I'm going to give you just a few examples of some of what we heard. So in my county, for example, this came up because of me being on this group. There are 5 neighborhoods. They each have a municipal septic system. The septic systems were originally built and owned and run by Connexus Energy, who then chose to sell them to a private investment hedge fund out of New Jersey for $500 or less for each one of them. Upon doing so, the MPCA had, prior to Connexus unloading them, if you will, had declared them non-compliant. And I can't recall the name of this company off the top of my head, but so they have now assessed every homeowner in all 5 of these neighborhoods more than $20,000, 23 to 28,000, and they've given them 3 years to pay this, under the premise that this work will be done in 3 years. One of the neighborhoods, their particular HOA, if you will, they were supposed to have about $250,000 in reserves for repairs that disappeared in the transfer, so it's gone. And they have zero access to any funding mechanisms whatsoever because they don't own the septic, and the septic company is out of state, and they don't qualify for the programs that are here. The counties can't help, MFHA can't help, or MHFA. Nobody can help these people, and several of them now are forced to. They tried to sell their house, but because it has this big old dark cloud hanging over it, nobody wants to buy it. It's roughly an extra $900 a month for each and every one of them. That's one example. And Mr. Elwood was frequently in our work group to help give us from a legal aid standpoint of some of what these people go through. There was another situation that was in Otsego. They experienced a hail claim. There are 4 plexes, so there are 4 corners on each building. They were each assessed $18,700 or $17,800, one of the two. Upon one of them simply sending an email asking questions because they have 20 years, they've been a roofer, they inspected the roof themselves, they didn't find any damage. And by sending the email, they then received a bill back from the HOA's or the property management's attorney for $2,000 additional dollars that was then assessed to that individual. So now his bill, it was $18,700 because now it was $20,700, which they then proceeded with foreclosure proceedings because he didn't have the money. I do believe that's been paused out in that particular scenario. However, in that particular case, it got a little more interesting because that particular property management company actually gave the contract to their sister company that does the construction work. And where it gets even a little more interesting is they signed the contract with their sister company a week before the hailstorm. Better weathermen than any of the ones we have on TV news.
Right.
So this is like some of the very, there's some of the more egregious stories. There was some, like a new HOA member gets elected or a chair, what have you, and they decide garbage cans can't sit out overnight. And you have an elderly couple, or maybe they're on vacation and they're Florida or whatever. Some of it was really, really petty stuff, but this was part of the training part that was a repeated statement that was in there that a lot of these people may just think they can run and do whatever they want. They don't understand there's some boundaries here and what their interests are. One of the most common threads that kept coming back, and where it gets really difficult, is when it is a shared space. It has a shared roof, shared walls, what have you. Multi-unit homes is a much more difficult animal and beast. The single-family home ones is much more clear-cut. Why are they telling people what kind of flowers they can plant in their front flower bed in the spring? Why are they telling them whether or not they can or cannot have a garden, a small garden in their backyard? Things of that nature. Why can they not have a sign on their front porch of whatever the case may be? A lot of that was much easier to delineate, and I think there's going to be some really strong language in the end of this bill that will discuss that part, some of those parts of it, as well as not allowing local municipalities to mandate certain amenities that basically force an HOA in play. Then, as Chair Bonner was saying, the other interesting part was that within the insurance, that these people are getting like really bad insurance products where this gets into commerce, and this was not in our wheelhouse. And not only that, there's so many different aspects to it. Let me go back to that one with the hail claim. I actually read the insurance estimate on this, and I've never seen anything like it, and I probably had 400 or 500 in the last 3 or 4 years, whatever it's been. And it has a 5% deductible on it, which, okay, let's just say the roof is 20 grand. I mean, whatever, it's a $1,000 deductible, is what most people, I think the average person would assume that means. And this particular insurance product was negotiated by the HOA, so they don't really, this is what they're given. They rate it a 5% deductible. I've never seen this before, so this was learning for me. In that an estimate, what that 5% deductible means is a total loss. So if the property's valued at $280,000 for that fourth of that building, their deductible is 5% of $280,000, not the claim for the roof. So the roof didn't even hit the benchmark. It was all fell within the deductible, or all but a couple $100. They had virtually no skin in the game for the insured product. And there lies something that's a much bigger animal to attack, and we're going to have some very strong knowledge set from commerce people and insurance industry to wrap that one up. And there was even talk about, towards the last meeting, I believe, why can't I do this on my balcony deck? And to which I jumped in on that part of it, because that's integrated building materials that affect the unit below and the unit above. So if you're not properly maintained, there's things of that nature. There was window sealing, but that could affect what gets moisture that gets behind the siding. That's where the multi-housing is a far more complex one, and that's where we kind of dove into I guess we took the low-hanging fruit first. But also, and it wasn't for a lack of not wanting to address the harder issues. It was that it's a far more complex issue than just, everybody, and we would certainly need more minds. So that was part of how we got to where we are. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Representative Mecklin. I guess with this part, let's lead into some questions. I think first on the list will be Representative Johnston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to, talk specifically about single-family home associations, because I recognize too that they are two separate scenarios. Touching back on Representative Myers had touched on, as far as making it more difficult or more invasive to get volunteers. I was a board member on our association. Why did I become a board member? Because nobody else would do it. And so basically, and the bylaws stated you had to have certain officers there, just like getting people to show up for voting. So I said, well, you need it, so I'll step up, and I think I became secretary or something like that. But anyway, my concern is, if you make it more difficult for volunteers to do it by throwing their name out there and making on the Secretary of State that you have to be identifiable, which I guess I'd have to go back to when I ran for representative. I could put P.O. Box as my location, right? So I could hide really where I live. So why would we require homeowners associations, people that are volunteering, to put their information out to the world? So then the other thing too is, if you make it more difficult and more invasive, aren't you inviting only the motivated activists, people with a desire to do something, would only want to take the time and effort to do it, instead of somebody that says, oh, I'm willing to do it, I'm going to participate and stuff like that? I'm just more concerned that you're making it to the point that the only people going to step up are the people that want to achieve something and go down the road that you're explaining. The other thing too is, we've had many discussions regarding how expensive homes have gotten. And so doesn't the homeowners association, to a point, and I recognize homeowner associations have gone crazy, but I think the one I'm in is fairly fair. But isn't part of the homeowners association also there to help protect the value of homeowners that have bought a $500,000, $600,000, $700,000 home, that somebody moving in next door has decided not to turn their home into a rental, has decided not to have 10 cars in front of their house, has decided not to put their door pink or let their siding go or their roofing go or anything like that, which brings down the value of the home that's next to them. So isn't there also a value in the homeowners association that they should be able to allow certain rules that, an example, what happened in my neighborhood is, when I was on the board, is we have a rule that, I think it's 5-foot black chain link fences. If you're going to do a fence, it has to be hookup. But then somebody decided, well, I don't want to, I'm putting in a pool, so I don't want a chain link fence anymore. I want a 7-foot, 8-foot white plexi fence, which totally changes the whole look of the neighborhood, because the way the neighborhood now is, you can kind of, it looks like it's an open community where you can just kind of look. All of a sudden, you become more chopped up community, and you lose touch. Shouldn't they, I mean, shouldn't homeowner association be able to actually have those kind of controls?
So there's a couple of things.
Representative Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a few things in there to unpack. You know, I think in terms of making it more difficult, I would say that right now, most boards are handed a set of bylaws that are often written by the builder. For most folks, I don't know if you've read your bylaws, some of the board members probably did, but what I hear regularly over and over again is that those documents were not really created for the board members. It was created more for the builder, and they sort of hand it over and they kind of say, wink, wink, good luck, you're on your own, kid. That's kind of the impression that we get. They are not user-friendly. They don't clearly allow, from my understanding, most board members to really have a clear understanding of the rules of the road. They don't set them up for success and to understand what can they do, what can't they do, what's reasonable, what are the processes that we follow to handle things like dispute resolution or things like that. And what I think is that ambiguity and that lack of transparency creates a series of problems, and they're all sort of interconnected, right? For one, you have board members who really don't understand what their roles and responsibilities are. Many of them often defer that to a property manager because they are confused, they don't know, they're not sure how to read them. The property managers often give really bad advice, sometimes illegal advice. You have them all going to an attorney to translate the law and what they can and can't do, but nobody actually has a clear definition of what that is. There's no transparency. And what we hear a lot is that it's a little like the grapevine, right? So we have this really crazy law that doesn't really explain things in plain language, so the only way to understand it is that you have to go through an attorney, which is really expensive. But even for the tiniest little question, you've got to, before you know it, you've got a couple $1,000 bill to answer whether or not something is or isn't permissible, right? And it starts with somebody said, would you like a grape? And before you know it, by the time you get to the homeowner and the board, it's, would you like an ape, right? Nobody knows. It's really confusing. It's really difficult. And I find that there's a real lack of clarity. And our attempt here is to do just that, is to provide greater clarity in the statute, to provide greater guardrails to protect the interests of individual homeowners and collectively. Because yes, of course, we want to protect our property values. We want to have nice homes. Everybody agrees. There's a heavy emphasis in our recommendations on the word reasonable. And what is a reasonable standard? And I think legally, and the lawyers in the room can speak to this much better than I can, but there is a reasonableness standard that most attorneys and judges rely on when they're resolving disputes. But what it basically says is that a reasonable person can assume that this is what it should be, right? For example, we saw things that in our discussion that are really beyond the pale, not reasonable, right? An individual who had a foreclosure notice over $56. $56, friends. A person who was up to date on all of their monthly dues, they paid them automatically, like clockwork, every single month. For some bizarre reason, this particular time, the notice did not go to the proper address. It was never received. And suddenly, this homeowner ends up with a bill of several $1,000s for a foreclosure over $56. Now, I think when we talk about the idea of reasonable, there is no one in this room who thinks it is reasonable to foreclose on someone's largest asset for $56. That's just not reasonable, right? What else is not reasonable? You know, in my community, we have a homeowners association with a lot of seniors. And they came to me and they said, we're really worried. And I said, well, what's going on? What's the problem? And she said, well, my association has decided that they no longer want to allow the garbage truck to drive on our road and pick up the garbage cans. I'm like, okay. She said, well, here's the thing. Right now, we have to carry our garbage to the end of the driveway. She goes, I'm in my 70s. My neighbor is in her 80s. We have another gal down the way in her 90s. And often my husband and I go out and we pull it down to the end of the driveway to be good stewards, right? To be good neighbors. But now the association has said instead of taking it to the end of the driveway, which is already a little perilous when you start to get up there in age, that now they want them, these seniors, who are maybe not the most able, in ice and snow, to drag their garbage cans down their driveway all the way down to the end of the block to leave the garbage can so that the garbage truck doesn't go down the road. Now, I have to be honest with you. I don't think most of us would think that was reasonable. I don't think we would want our 80-year-old grandmother trying to haul a garbage can down the block over ice and snow. That's not reasonable, right? And that's the kind of stuff we're talking about here. We're not talking about, we don't need to micromanage every single thing they do. And I hope that what we're trying to do here is set reasonable expectations for boards, for property managers, to talk about things like conflict of interest and how we address those issues. By the way, Minnesota is one of the only states that does not have conflict of interest around homeowners associations and CICs in the country. There are only a handful that don't, and we are one of them. So we're a little bit overdue there. So I think really this is about, again, following those principles, plain language. It's about reasonableness, clarity, fairness, and transparency. And that's really the driving force behind every single recommendation from the report. It's also the driving force between everything that will be going into a bill. Now, we will, I'm sure, have robust debate about those specifics and what that looks like. And I'm sure that the legislation will change and pivot in the ways that it always does as stakeholders come to the table. But that's really our hope here, is to provide sort of those common sense rules of the road, and not necessarily to overstep, but to give some clarity.
Thank you, Representative Bonner.
Yeah.
Do you have any follow-up, Representative Johnson?
No, thank you, Chair.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Representative Meckland.
In reference to Representative Johnson's question, yeah, nobody wants the purple house in the middle of a lake property in Chanhassen. I get it. I couldn't help myself on that one because that was big news back then. But at the same time, what we see, so there's many instances, and there's actually, someone just emailed me yesterday. The city says the builder's got to create an HOA, then, was it 10 years? Is that right? 10 years later, they basically kick them loose to the local homeowners. There's one up there, they've been trying to dissolve this thing for years. Not a single person that's on that HOA board still lives in Minnesota. They're all retired builders, and they will not relinquish the control they have over it. Some of these were established back in the day when they may have said, you have to use fiber cement siding. And if that language is still there, it's part of why there's a sunset thing in here. That doesn't make any sense anymore. We moved on. I personally won't even install it anymore. We've gone to LP if you want to go to a higher end siding. But even at that, they become so, there's so many different prerequisites that basically buy or charge people out of ownership. They simply can't afford it. And if you're going to use the example of $500,000 or $600,000 or $700,000 homes, which in this day and age, the 500 is basically a starter home now in Minnesota, unfortunately, or it's getting very close to it. But when you get into the higher end neighborhoods, I mean, for them to even afford it, I'm not guessing that they're going to want to paint their house purple. But to mandate they must have 3-car garages, or they must be 90-foot wide lots, or they must have brick faces all the way up and around the entire front and wrap around the sides, when that may not be something that is necessarily needed for that particular home buyer. If it's an elderly couple like Chair Bonner just talked about, they have 1 car. They don't need a 3-car garage. They're on their, easy years, if you will. And that's where so much of this has run amok. And I do understand that there's, as it was said, reasonable. And there's too many stories of unreasonable. I was talking to Mr. Elwood here, who represents a lot of these people when the HOA runs amok, if you will. And what was interesting, I think that Chair Bonner will agree with me, there are some legitimate stories where an HOA has a very problematic, whether it be a tenant or a homeowner. Those stories exist. But for every challenged HOA there's 30 to 40 challenged homeowners by HOA. So the numbers are staggering on this side that have problems compared to over on this side. But the numbers are not hard to figure out when we finally get the final numbers from the Secretary of State in a year or whatever it's going to be to isolate. I mean, there's millions of people affected by, 10,000 different HOAs. And some of these HOAs, that they get elected, they don't want to deal with it, so they turn it over to a property management company that has full reign over these people's life, and there's nothing they can do about it. And they can just assess these people arbitrary numbers. The roofing particular one that I mentioned, I looked at every one of those roofs, and I wouldn't have charged any one of them anywhere near what they got forced to pay because it was way inflated. So, and they have no legal way out of this. The Attorney General has no teeth in any law whatsoever for them to step in and help these people. Now, in that case, there might be some really weird insurance stuff went on, like we know a hailstorm's coming a week from now.
Yeah.
But at the same point, those are the outliers. That's not the everyday scenario. And we talk about, we're 107,000 units short in Minnesota right now. We have these cities and municipalities that simply are putting their responsibilities off onto HOAs, and then they're mandating that they want certain looks or certain amenities that the city basically is taxing these people for, and the HOA is charging them monthly dues to maintain at the same time. Thus, that is addressed in this as well. So it's a much more complex thing. There are 2 sides to everything, but clearly, would you not agree with me, Chair Bonner, there's a heck of a lot more people that are being adversely affected than HOAs.
Representative Bonner.
Mr. Chair, I think it was pretty telling in the testimony during the work group and during the listening sessions that there were some pretty clear themes. And again, we want to be clear. Most associations do a great job. A lot of boards are fantastic. They do really good work. These are volunteers who step up, they give their own time, they have the best intent possible, and I want to be very crystal clear about that. But it's very easy to see that currently the way our statute is set up, we don't have clear rules of the road to prevent abuses. We don't have clear rules of the road to protect consumers. A lot of the pieces of our statute are really ambiguous, and they provide virtually no checks and balances, and they provide very little recourse for homeowners when things go awry. And I don't think you find a lot of places in the law where that actually is the case. And in this case, it is very clear that even when homeowners or even the association themselves have been wronged, they really have nowhere to turn. And when they do try to take matters into their own hands, I talked to a number of attorneys who handle this type of law, and what they will usually say is even if your association, even if your property manager, even if it is whatever they did, even if it is egregiously wrong, you are better off paying the fine You are better off paying the attorney fees, whatever it is, and do it now. Because if you don't do it now, that $56 is going to turn into $2,000. And that $2,000 is going to turn into $5,000. I have one homeowner who eventually ended up trying to fight something that was egregiously wrong and spent nearly $30,000 of their own money. We're harassed by that. And Mr. Elwood here can probably tell you more because he actually works for Legal Aid. You know, things like being told that you're going to be fined $50 if you attempt to ask a question at a meeting for homeowners, and you have a question. If you ask for a document, a simple document that should be available to every homeowner, a copy of the bylaws or a copy of a budget or something like that, they're being told, yeah, well, you can have a copy, but it's going to cost you $250. I mean, I don't know anybody who would think that if I go to my bank and I open a bank account and my money is in it, that I should have to be charged $250 to get a bank statement. I don't think that's reasonable, right? And I think what we've seen is just so many issues where the themes are unmistakable, that this really needs a time and attention, and that is really what we're hoping to do.
Thank you, Representative Bonner. So I think we're going to move. Do we have a few more questions? We'll keep working through them here. So I think next on the list will be Representative Hilsley. Representative Hilsley? It's all good.
Thank you so much, Chair, for that, and thank you for both of you guys presenting on this. So, unlike my freshman colleague, Representative Johnson, stated in like 20 questions, I'm going to be very specific. I have 3 questions for you, and I'm going to ask them individually so you're able to respond directly. The questions are based on they're centered on homeowners, and this is coming from my door knocking during campaign season. And so, from your perspective, what protections exists for homeowners against abuse or unresponsive HOA management companies?
Who wants to take that one?
I'll say it.
Representative Mecklen.
Currently, there's none.
Okay.
I mean, if any, it's extremely little. I mean, Mr. Elwood can explain. I mean, he represents a lot of these cases. That's why we leaned on him so heavily through a lot of this, especially for the, was it 515B?
Yeah.
He knows this thing inside and out. But there is none, to answer that question in short.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Thank you, Chair. My next question is, what steps are being taken to ensure that HOA are not being used as a tool for housing discrimination and exclusionary zoning?
Who wants to take this one? I just don't want to pick on someone, so.
Well, that one
Representative
is.
Bonner.
Thank you. We might need legal aid assistance here, but that one's a little bit more difficult to answer. There are a number of provisions, and I think the chairs here can probably speak to that better than I. There are specific provisions in law already around housing discrimination. We did not dive as deeply into that specific topic. We talked a lot about making sure that housing was accessible and affordable in HOA properties. There were some questions about specifics around civil rights and human rights and things like that. Those typically exist in other parts of the law currently, but Ron, you may have more on that, but so specifically that wasn't within the scope perhaps of what we were doing, although certainly that would be part of the larger affordability issue to some extent. And when we talk about driving folks out of their home because of costs and rising prices and fines and fees and really unreasonable foreclosure issues, that gets to the heart of what you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Because some of the most affected folks by that are the single-family homes. They are lower-income families. They are folks that might be in more vulnerable populations or populations of color. And I think, so quite frankly, there's a lot to break off here into how we get at the core of affordability. And certainly that could be a whole nother work group on its own. And I know there has been some conversation with Chair Howard on this very issue in the past. So I'm gonna try to like not step on his toes in that respect. But that's kind of the simple answer.
Thank you, Representative Bonner. And one more, right, Representative Hiltz?
Yes, Chair. Thank you so much, Chair. Last one. So as a first-time homeowner myself, my husband and I were very intentional about not buying a home in an HOA establishment because of the stories and the scary just scenarios that I have come across. And so many homeowners in my district struggle to challenge HOA decisions because of the costly legal fees. And I think you guys touched on that a little bit. Are there alternative dispute resolution options, such as state level, possibly, mediation that could be implemented to protect homeowners' rights?
Representative Meckland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, once this turns into this, and once this is jacketed and put through, yes, there will be. A lot of that is addressed in here, because currently, again, there isn't a whole lot there. I mean, there was a representative from the Attorney General's office, and they literally, as egregious as some of these stories were, they have nothing.
Yeah.
There's no legislative protections for anything. There's no teeth anywhere for them to touch on. And I mean, I think some of it, we just were kind of like shocked. Like, this has been going on this long, and it's clear over the decades, they realize that they don't, for those that are not doing it right, because a lot of them do it right, but there's no guardrails for them, and they just keep pushing the envelope, and some of it has become, I mean, when you're talking about, I don't know, 800-900 people and 5 developments that all just got slapped with a $25,000 thing, that they have 3 years to pay it, and they have no way out of it. They have nothing. And they have no guarantee. Like, I actually said, can you like put it in an escrow account, let a bank sit on, and you just prove you're paying it in so that it's there when they're gonna do the work? And they said, no, we can't. I mean, they looked into it. I mean, and you know, some of this stuff I would pick on Mr. Elwood going, this can't be true, but it is. So once we narrow this down, I do believe there's gonna probably be some standalone pieces that are gonna come apart, that'll probably have a little more interest or a focus on them, you know, kind of the belt and suspenders thing. So at the end of the day, this is to try to let you all know kind of what we've all been going through or been talking about, discussing, hearing, learning. And there's been a lot of thought and time and talent that's got into this. So that was the whole point of kind of today, so that you could all see like what we all did in our interim.
Thank you, Representative Meckland.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to both of you guys for this. This is something I'm really interested in, so I look forward to reading what's in that bill. Thank you.
All right, next on the list will be Representative Norris.
Thank you, Chair Igo. Since I'm legally obligated to mention manufactured housing at least once a day, I couldn't help but call out recommendation 1.7 about housing cooperatives. I've talked a lot about how I think one of the best ways to address some of the issues we're seeing with manufactured housing is move as many of these parks to resident-owned cooperatives as possible. But one of the big barriers we've faced here in Minnesota is prior to 2024, we didn't have a housing co-op statute. And so these parks were having to pull from the ag co-op statute and from our HOA statutes and try to kind of, you know, duct tape together the legal parameters for governing one of these housing cooperatives. And so in 2024, I led the work to create 308C, which is a separate statute for housing cooperatives. But at the time, one of the things we were wrestling with was how do we address the interplay with our common interest community statute. And so I'm glad to see that that was addressed by this working group. I know there's some work already going on with the bar about how do we disentangle those two so that we can make it even easier for manufactured home park communities or other housing cooperatives to get started and govern themselves here in the state. And so looking forward to continued work on that, and thanks for making sure that that was part of the recommendations.
Thank you, Representative Norris. Next on the list will be Representative Dotseth.
Thank you, Chair and Representatives. Question I've got, I think I appreciate your addressing this issue. I'm going to play the devil's advocate a little bit here. I think we understand that we've had an uptick of HOAs, and a lot of it is to help create affordability as well, because we've got shared common space, shared roofs, et cetera. Question I have is there not a timeline when a homeowner purchases in a HOA that they have an opportunity to review those documents? And if so, what is that timeline?
It's 10 years. What's the bill established? Is it 10 years?
No, 30, I think they have 10 days.
10, right? Okay.
Representative Meckland,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
let your deliberations continue. Yeah.
Oh, wait, I had to pull some legal counsel here. So basically, when these are established by the city, it tells the developer builder that they want to you're required to establish an HOA. The builder basically carries that HOA for 10 years, and then it's turned over to that of the neighborhood at that point. That's the one I cited a little bit ago, where there's one in somewhere around St. Cloud, where the group of those members are, none of them which live in the neighborhood anymore, they're refusing to turn it over, they're refusing to dissolve it, they're refusing to do anything. Yet they're maintaining control, and they do have the ability to assess fees, dues, assessments for whatever they deem that they don't like. And when it should technically be with the confines of the regulatory should be within that neighborhood, the people that actually live there, not somebody that now lives in Florida, I guess, is where the one is. So, and as far as affordability goes, that's where it really gets into question, because many of these people are paying the same thing twice. They're paying taxes to the city for all what the city's supposed to be taking care of, the curb, the common grass area, what have you. There's one, I think it's Sartell, where they're literally paying them all the same piece of grass twice. They pay the city for it, they pay the HOA for it. And they get a bill for both. So.
Maybe a follow-up or
I think Representative Bonner just want to tack on, and we'll head back to you, Vice Chair.
I think if I heard your question correctly, I think you are actually referring to if someone is attempting to buy an HOA or into an HOA, how long do they have to review the documents and decide whether they want to purchase that home?
that is correct.
That is 10 days. And so, but here's what I've heard often is that in some cases, real estate agents are really great about making sure that they ask for those documents and that they try to get them to it within a timely fashion, and that once they get them, they have that 10-day period. There's a couple things about that I just want to bring up really clearly. Often those documents are not written in plain language. They are very difficult to read and to understand. It's a little bit like when you're going into an app and they give you this like 50-mile long thing, and you're supposed to check the box at the bottom. Nobody understands what the legalese is or what it does or how it works or any of that. One of the suggestions we have been talking about is that certain documents be made available before the purchase of that home, and that those documents be provided in plain language so that homeowners coming in, not only do they understand the rights and responsibilities that they have as homeowners, and they understand what some of those limitations might be. Because there are certain things that you give up when you go into an HOA, like, no, you cannot paint your house purple, right? So knowing that you cannot just paint your house purple, while that does limit your personal freedoms, it's important to know that that is part of what you're buying into, right? That there are certain rules of the road that folks want to adhere to, right? And I think that's reasonable, again, because you're talking about wanting to maintain property values and keep up the neighborhood and all those things. But the other thing I want to mention too is that when we talk about HOAs, I would sort of lump them in two categories. You have sort of the naturally occurring housing, much of which has been out there for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? And has been steadily growing. But you also have sort of the newer homes. And I will be very frank, based on median incomes and so forth, and I'm sure Mr. Elk could probably give you more information on this, but I would suggest that a lot of what we see in the new construction space is costing upwards of $700,000. And I'm just going to be really frank. I don't know that I would call that affordable, particularly when you add on, not only are you paying the mortgage on a $700,000 home, you're now paying dues on top of that. Plus, you may be paying special assessments on top of that. Plus, even if you have a master policy under your or with the HOA, you're also going to need to have your own personal insurance to cover any of your liabilities over and above what the insurance company has. And in some cases, you also have this double taxation issue, which Representative Macklin referred to, in which you may have competing authorities here where you're actually being taxed for maintenance of property by both your city and your HOA. So I just want to be thoughtful about the fact that we're kind of talking about two different things when we talk about affordability, that there's really two very different perceptions of that. There's the naturally occurring older housing that maybe is much more in that affordable price point versus, you know, really high-end homes that are lovely and wonderful in planned communities, but I don't know that I would go so far as to call them affordable.
Thank you, Representative Bonner. Any follow-up, Vice Chair Dotseth?
Just to follow up, but my understanding also after the 10 days, they also have, what, a right of rescission as well after that, or
They have a,
right of rescission? If they choose to back out of the contract, they can, is that correct?
I believe
The
so.
purchasers?
So,
I'm not a real estate attorney, just to be fair.
sounds like something we need to follow up on.
So
Awesome.
I will trust you, Representative Dodseth, if that is the case. I believe there is some provisions for homeowners under that. I can't speak to that. I don't want to get myself in trouble by trying to pretend that I know.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next on the list will be Representative Ekbache.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both Representative Bonner and Representative Mecklin. This is I'm glad that this took off this year, and it seems like you guys learned a lot. One of the things I wanted to see if you could, if you're able to dig into it, or if we have to wait till the bill comes out, but what are the actual enforcement measures in the bill? I know one of the things you guys talked about is that currently, right now, there's no enforcement on these laws, but what are you planning that enforcement looks like?
Yeah.
Representative Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Ekbaje. Well, first I wanted to point out that we talked a little bit earlier about, in one of the earlier testimonies about the AG and where there are instances where they just don't have anything to fall back on to act. It's not that they don't want to. In fact, many times they will advise homeowners that, you know, we'd be happy to write a letter on your behalf, but I just want you to realize that if we write a letter on your behalf, you could be charged a few $100s to $1,000 just for us writing a letter to your HOA, right? Which is a little bit crazy pants. So often they will tell them they can't do anything just because they don't actually want homeowners to incur a larger expense. Not that they're not willing. Also, just as a reference, the earlier conversation about the HOA who may have had a roofing claim where the hailstorm, they signed off on the bid a week before the actual hailstorm occurred. By the way, I'm pretty sure the AG is actually looking into that one, because in this case, that would be insurance fraud. That actually is on the books, and they can explore that. The enforcement mechanisms for this, the policy bill itself focuses on dispute resolution and what those methodologies would be. And primarily we focus in the policy side of the bill on internal dispute resolution. Now, the larger conversation around that would be a conversation about moving to something like an ombudsman. That is the other bill that we have that's running separately, because there's a little bit more money attached to it, but that would give them greater authority. And that would also potentially lead into other claims by the AG or things like that on that side, if I am not mistaken. And yes, I'm getting a head nod, making sure I'm staying within the realm there. And then finally, there has been a conversation about mediation as sort of a middle step. We have not required mediation at this point in time. And the reason we have not done so is because mediation costs money. And it costs the homeowner money, it can cost the association money. And so we've tried to separate two different pathways. So sort of that internal resolution before we get to the courts and before it gets to that place, can we reasonably handle it here? Versus when all else fails and it doesn't work, we would ultimately like to have an ombudsman to be able to address those deeper issues and to set up rules and make sure that we're addressing the teeth and the enforcement behind that.
That's great.
Thank you, Representative Bonner. Any follow-up, Representative
Yes,
Agbaje?
thank you, Mr. Chair. Just one quick follow-up. I know I've had this conversation briefly with you, but I'd be really interested in reading more about the dissolution aspects of it. I have a specific HOA in my area. They've been dealing with the lack of an ability to dissolve their HOA, partly because of some of the owners, as Representative Mecklin was talking about, aren't really there. They don't want to give up their property rights. And so, but the rest of the people who do live there are ready to move on, and yet they're stuck. So looking forward to having more conversations about that. So.
Representative
Mr.
Bonner.
Chair, Representative Agbaje, I do want to mention, and I owe you a comment back. We were actually working on, we had a bit of a difference of opinion on that very specific piece that we were ironing out between the House and Senate. We think we have a resolution to that. That'll be in the new bill from Ms. Davis and from the Senate side. So I can get you a copy of that language.
Perfect. Next on the list then will be Representative Rehrauer.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to take my time for a question here to actually just make a comment. When I was door knocking during campaign season, because I am a freshman legislator, this topic was probably the one that people at the doors got the most heated about, and it was almost always issues with their HOA. So I saw firsthand at the doors the numbers that you're talking about. So I just want to thank Representative Bonner and Representative Mecklin for digging into this work, making these detailed recommendations that put some reasonable, I like the word reasonable, guardrails on this. So thank you.
Thank you. And we'll move then in next to Representative Kozlowski.
Thank you, Chair, and to Representative Bonner and Mecklin and team for really elevating and highlighting and digging into this issue as we're facing our housing crisis across the country. From Greater Minnesota, I'm especially grateful that you went border to border and that you took the time to really go out and speak with the people most impacted. I really think the number that you highlighted, the 82% of new homes sold in 2023 were part of a CIC, was pretty surprising. And I think I heard you mention that the report would be coming out with further data, but I was just curious to start if there would be data that teases out who lives in these HOA and CIC communities, especially around people of color, seniors, and some themes that we might be able to garner, from Greater Minnesota and Metro, those types of things. Is that data that will be coming in the report later?
Unlikely. I don't think so. Representative Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Kozlowski. In all honesty, I don't think we have a good handle on that data. And part of the mission of the work group was to try and start teasing out some of that information, because the truth is we don't know. We hear the conversations on the ground. We hear the stories. We hear a lot of pieces. But we really don't know what that overall picture looks like. There really isn't good data on a lot of that. Now, some of the organizations like CAI, I think, have attempted to try to get some reasonable idea, but really a lot of that really just doesn't exist. Most of it is anecdotal, and most of it is, as all of you, literally when we are going door to door talking to homeowners, we hear the stories. That was the other reason why, because we really couldn't do that. It was the other reason why it was so fundamentally important to me and to, I think, a lot of our members, that we did have those public listening sessions, that we were getting out into the community and actually at talking to people, hearing what their experiences were, because we wanted them to have a forum to actually come out and speak to legislators and stakeholders and really have a say in the crafting of this legislation.
Any follow-up, Representative Kozlowski?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and I appreciate that, Representative. I know last year when I believe you brought this bill, and we're working on HOAs and creating the working group to the committee, we talked about zoning, and we're carrying these bills, and one of the things that for me is important is addressing how our communities were created and the types of housing and the opportunities that we have. And HOAs played a big role in that segregation in the suburbs in the first place. And so just thinking through, like, I'm really glad to see the recommendations on capping standard, creating like standardized fines and fees and assessments. I think the $2,000 fees that you were talking about, just getting the roof inspected and from lawyers' fees is outrageous for anybody who could afford that, let alone if you're a senior on a fixed income or, families of color who are facing racial wealth gaps. I'm wondering two questions, and I'll wrap it up here. If in the fines and fees that we know are leading in like a gateway into foreclosures, if foreclosure reform specific to these communities would be something to look at, similar to how we did a lot of work around evictions reforms and setting standardized times, different resources and those types of things. And then if you could talk about the Housing Advocacy Center, I would be grateful. Thank you.
Mr.
Representative Bonner.
Mr. Chair and Representative Kozlowski, yes, I think the good news is some of what you mentioned here, particularly the pieces around foreclosure and how fines and fees impact that, it's in the bill. So good news. Now, I'm sure there will be folks who will think it's not enough, and some will think it's too much. But there are some real guidelines around what that looks like, because I think we all agree, again, things like having going to foreclosure in under 30 days for $56 isn't reasonable. But we also appreciate that for homeowners associations, not being able to collect things like dues has a real direct impact on their ability to hire the maintenance company or to get repairs done or things like that. And many of them just simply don't have the reserves to be able to, go too far afield on those issues. So it matters, right? And we're trying to find a way to strike a balance between those two things. We want associations to be able to do their work and be whole, but we also want to have some reasonable guardrails, particularly around things like foreclosure. It is typically, for most people, it is their largest asset. And so we want to be very thoughtful about how we address that. And we want to get closer to having similar protections to what ordinary homeowners would have, and have similar protections for folks who are living in these common interest communities, because many of them, these are folks who've been living there for 10, 20 years. This is the affordable option, right? If they were to move out of their association, the alternatives are definitely not even in the ballpark of affordable. And if they're struggling to afford their mortgage and their dues in a CIC or an HOA, imagine the sticker shock of trying to go out and find an apartment, which is $2,000 to $3,000 a month and takes up over 50% of your available income. And so I think that is a real driver here, and we need to find ways to start getting those guardrails in place.
Thank you. I think then with that, we'll move into some closing comments here by Lead Howard.
Thank you, Chair Igo, and thank you both, Representative Bonner and Representative Meckland. The main thing I just want to express is gratitude. I mean, this is really good work that's been done. For the past many years, as in the Housing Committee, I think as legislators, we kept hearing story after story, and I think everyone's got their story. But you've really turned anecdote into action here, and really am grateful that we're going to have actionable legislation to move on this. And I really do think this is squarely within our work this year. to make housing more affordable and attainable for Minnesotans. And that 82% number jumped off the page for me too, that 82% of new homes sold. And that tracks right with a bar graph when you look at the price point of homes that are being sold. I think all of us have seen a presentation from the Minnesota Realtors that last year, for the first time ever, the largest share of new homes sold are in the $500,000 or more bracket for the first time ever. And so we shouldn't be surprised that also for the highest number ever is the age at which people can afford to buy a home, which is 37 years old now for the average first-time home buyer. And there's just no question that HOAs and local governments alike play a role in what's driving up the cost of housing. And I really think we need to approach this from a perspective of freedom. Minnesotans ought to have the freedom to build the kind of home that fits their community and the community they choose. And so some of the examples that Representative Mecklin raised about homes mandated with 3-car garages and brick, though maybe a family doesn't want those things. Maybe they want to actually afford a home. And so I think this work helps and is a key part of it. And I can't wait to see these bills as they hit introduction soon. So thank you both.
Thank you, Lead Howard. Well, I'll just make some closing comments. You know, listening to the questions from the committee here and the testimony that you two both brought forward from your experiences, you know, it's interesting. You don't see it every day in committee when you see both sides of the aisle are doing this while people are talking. And I think that really highlights an opportunity for this committee to really dive in, roll up our sleeves, and get good policy done and set a real good standpoint for what this committee can accomplish. So I can't be thankful enough to you, Representative Bonner, for taking your time to be with us today. Thank you, Representative Mecklin, for taking the stand. And this conversation, because as this bill comes forward, I know that this committee is going to be very interested in wanting to read through it and how we can partner to find these solutions to help out Minnesotans and get back to that affordability and reliability to create stable homes for stable families in Minnesota. So thank you guys very much. So just some closing things. Our next committee meeting will meet on Tuesday, the 18th at our regularly scheduled time. And the agenda will be posted shortly in the coming days. So with that, if there's no further questions or anything, we are adjourned.